Everyone, and welcome to the Faber Piano Adventures Showcase live webinar. It's great to be able to be here and communicate with you. I have to say that I really wish we were all in Chicago, having a good time at the restaurants and at the booths and being able to speak and meet in person. But with that not being the case, I have to say that I'm very honored and pleased that we could communicate in this manner. You know, things are changing so fast that you know as well as all of us. Just last night, the governor for the state of Michigan put out an order that everyone needs to stay at home as of today. No work, can't go to the work location. And so we've had to scramble. We had quite a sophisticated webinar set up at the Faber Institute, and which we were looking forward to and ready to go. And suddenly, last night we had to scramble and do a makeshift accommodation. So we're actually broadcasting here out of the home. Nancy's in my home, and with an iPhone. So we're in the same ballpark that you are in terms of having to adjust, use technology at hand, and using our improvisation skills. So we hope the bandwidth is good. We hope this gets through to you okay, despite all the activity of people on the web at this time, and that we're doing more of the low-tech version of what we anticipated. But nonetheless, very happy to be here. My goal for this presentation isn't so much to show new product, but it's to connect and talk about what we're all experiencing and to share whatever help I can and how we deal with it, and hearing from you via your postings back of what are our learnings, what are your learnings, and how can we be best help to you at this time. I'd like to focus on our title a moment. We have the title of this presentation is New Tools and Timeless Traditions. Now, when I wrote the title for the showcase some time ago, it had a different meaning than it does now, because I was thinking timeless traditions. To me, that meant traditions from the 1700s, 1800s, and now traditions, timeless traditions almost seems to mean teaching 2 weeks ago where we could actually sit with the student on the bench and play a duet. So things are changing fast, but a little note there that it's temporary. So we keep that in mind. The other thing, new tools in my mind when conceiving of the showcase presentation, I was thinking new educational tools. How can we interact with the student with deeper learning, deeper engagement, more passionate learning? But it seems these days, new tools means a new technological device and interventions. Everybody's clamoring to Zoom and Skype and looking for the next big new thing. We have to be cautious about that. And I think here I'd like to be just a little bit of a counterpoint to what we see everyone else clamoring to. Digital learning, online, remote learning may be necessary for your studio to maintain a certain financial viability if you're really dependent on the income over the next several weeks. But it's a real caution here because we don't want to get confused about what's best practice. You know as well as I do the power of our person-to-person interactions with the students, are being able to play that duet, hear and share the sounds with the student. There's an immense history that we have, immense timeless traditions of what's workable, what's meaningful. And when we respect traditions, then we find it's the elements, the processes that are anchored in time that survive and can maybe slowly modified and shifted to adjust to new times. But fundamentally, they are the processes that are best practices because they've worked, and that's the reason they've survived. We have a great example of that right in our own Western music culture. The masterworks, the works of art that have survived have done so because of the exquisite beauty in that art, the masterful handling of composition, colors, nuance, whatever the art form may be. So if we think of our teaching as an art form, let's not lose sight of the timeless tradition. There's something that happens, I think, in our minds, even in our brains, if you will, due to these troubling situations that we're confronted with. The mad scramble to be active, to find what solution do I need. It can be somewhat chaotic. And so the scramble for the new tools can sometimes not be a result of fine analytical thinking and thoughtful planning, but more might be a response to the anxiety that's building. There's two modes that can occur so readily at this time is we can respond with that intense urge to grab something new, intense new activity, or else we can become frozen. And those are both states that are non-optimal. So we want to engage our more musical mind, if you will, musical minds and hearts that we use for training students in terms of their thinking and their sensibility. We grasp onto that and let that anchor us in the here and now, such that we don't fall victim to the mental processes that can take over, but instead we have the fluidity between them, brain hemispheres, fluidity of thought. I want to dwell on that just a little bit because it's so important. Some of the latest neuroscience is developing an understanding or beginning to have an understanding of processes of thought in the brain. So no longer thinking about this part of the brain does this part of the brain does that, but they're essential networks that work together in the brains for modes of thought. And it's pretty interesting that they're inhibitory, contradictory relationships. In other words, one neural network turns on, and what that does is it flips and shuts off the other neural network. So you get this kind of antipathetic shifting that can sometimes be pro-survival, but often it can be non-survival. We have the executive functioning. The executive network is a default network that's more of our intuitive, insightful, creative mode. And then there's this one that's just come up in terms of nearest and the most recent in the literature that I want to highlight here, and that's known as the salience network. And the problem with the salience network is that what hijacks our attention. See, the salience network can be good in that if we want to focus our attention, we can grab onto something consciously in our own ownership of that attention. We can grab on and do deep thinking, deep work, and be very productive. But tied in that same network of dripping the dopamine, so to speak, which gives that motivation, is some of the more base brain functions. So the salience network can grab something out of fear and then turn off our more serene functions and pushing us into chaotic activity or a state of frozen in fear. So we're going to use our musical minds and hearts to avert that, to give us the mental stability through this time. And as artists, we owe that not only to ourselves, but also to our families and to our students and to our communities. We look at this slide here, noting A and B with a horizontal bar in between. It's not a bar line exactly, but it is a vertical bar, excuse me, and that vertical bar I've labeled inflection. Note that it's not infection, it's inflection, but right now they're kind of one and the same. The A, what I'm referring to here is the state A. This is the state of being, our social state as we've known it. And with the inflection of the crisis, now we're in a state B. And you can see right away, if we look at the slide where I labeled the B in red, there's a bit of a crisis or fear element to this because it's the unknown of how long are we going to be in state B. And that's a profound point, and that's what I think affects us so acutely. If we look at the next slide, we can see this green arrow that I've got, the dotted line that goes in the past. How long have we had state A? Well, music has been going on for hundreds of years, and music tutelage, the student-mentor relationships that we're so familiar with and we're so competent and comfortable with, that has been going on for centuries. So it only stands to reason that if the music goes on for centuries, it's not going to suddenly stop now. This isn't going to be the end of our traditions. We can project that out, and we see that green line, the same elements of traditions, the soulfulness and the warmth and the importance of music and music education continues. It will continue, it has to continue. It's part of the lifeblood of humanity. And that has implications for us regarding B, because that point B then isn't going to be forever. It's not at all the end point here. It showed it shows to be a transition or a temporary. True that it may be very potent and it may be powerful and we can't predict how much damage it'll be or how long, but it's definitely temporary because there's another inflection point just around the corner, and that's the recovery inflection. So we have an A and a B, and then what comes next is a return to A. And it could be that A is going to be not exactly the same. Maybe we have some learnings, maybe we have some improvements, maybe we have some adjustments for a while. So we could say maybe A prime if we want to use our musical metaphor, but we have indeed the return. If we go to the next slide, notice here something very familiar to us as musicians, A, B. If we put on our hat, go back to class of form and analysis from college, and what do we notice here? What's the musical form? Yeah, that's a binary form, isn't it? A binary form, and in a way that's what we're fearful of right now, and that's where we find ourselves right at the moment. But it's interesting to note that even in Baroque times, when that binary form was so popular, how long did it last before the composer started to return to the A theme? In other words, remember rounded binary form? The bringing back, the recalling or recapitulating A within the B. So following that development type nature of B, then we recapitulate the theme embedded in B. That came so soon after because it's a natural systems orientation. It's what we gravitate to as the return to normalcy, to return to something familiar. So if we look at this then with our two bar lines here, we have A and then B and then the return to A. Indeed, this is our ternary form, song form, if you will, that we're so comfortable with and familiar with in our musical forms. And what a relief, right? We have the recapitulation. There's a relief, even how the mind responds to that. I mentioned the salience network, where the attention is grabbed. Well, it's grabbed, even in music, it's grabbed from the surprise element. Often it's the development section of the Beethoven. You can actually measure in the brain, boom, there's a grabbing of interest that just grabs the brain. And then when that recap comes in and we return to the primary theme, there's a relaxation. And so I think this musical metaphor is wonderful. It's something that we can come back to. Because as I mentioned earlier, when the brain gets hijacked into different mental states and we get this kind of kicking back and forth between a non-optimum mental state and then we come back into the optimal, we can remind ourselves of the musical form. We can use the musical metaphors for centering. This morning as I woke up, I heard the birds singing. It's not quite spring in Michigan. We had snow just the other day, but those birds are sort of a recap of the seasonality and the cycle of life that is a cycle of society. So we're living through something that is indeed difficult for us to grasp, but it's something that collectively and socially and with that anchoring of our musical minds and heart, our love and connection, we're going to be able to get through this and have the relief and really the wonder and the beauty of the recapitulation. This next slide I'm sharing here, some of our new product area for Piano Adventures. These are the books. If we had our showcase in full swing at the convention, I'd be sharing these in quite a bit of detail. But I want to touch on them some here, some more than others. But we have, first of all, the Scale Book 3. Many have been asking, what about Scale Book 3? We have Scale Book 1, which is the 5-finger patterning, the pentascales, lots of transpositions and improvisation. And the Scale Book 2 is the 1-octave scale with those challenge variations that allow the student to have some digging in opportunities of transposition and getting to know important patterning in that scale. And then here we are into multi-octave scales, multi-octave arpeggios, and a great section on harmony that really brings it all together. This book has a lot of power. I've subtitled it Harmony in Motion. It's not just a typical scale book, it's indeed a real talent maker because it's taking the meaningful patterns of Western music, playing them out across the keyboard. So we have it in motion through time, if you will, and we have it in motion through our technical, physical handling of these patterns across the keyboard. We'll look at that in detail shortly. The other point here, the other item is this Piano Adventures Sight-Reading Coach. You may be familiar with our sight-reading books in Piano Adventures. The theme and variations concept of having 5 days of variations of a lesson book piece, so that these variations are picking up on the similar and what's different. Remember our new tools and timeless traditions? We might say that there's the new and the same. In other words, what's novel and what's familiar. And that juxtaposition of working back and forth of being able to find what's similar, what's the same, and finding what's different allows really intense and robust pattern recognition. And so that's a process of working through to find and build that patterns and to repeatedly confront them to have the recollection and recognition of the patterns. So we saw that in the scale book, and we'll get into that in detail, but notice the sight reading approach is through the variations of what's familiar, allows the difference to stand out. And then the eye, just as we do as proficient readers, we don't necessarily read every note. We can interpolate that we're in A flat, so when we see an E flat 7 chord, it just comes out as 5/7. Our fingers will fall into some voicing of that, even if we may do a voicing that we miss on the fly. So we have that interpolation that comes about because we know the pattern so well. So this is a process then that we can develop the talent in the child by helping them see what's similar, so those patterns become incredibly more familiar and more recognizable, and then highlighting and putting the attention on what's different, because that's going to require that extra spotting, the extra work, you might say, the mental, extra sensory perception and the physical sensation to catch what's different in that moment in time. Now, the sight reading coach then also has some great elements to it, because that coach is actually an app, and we'll look at that in just a minute. The other product here is the Music from China series, a great a new series that celebrates our friendship around the world. Let's look at each of these for a moment, and before we dig into detail, we talked about that lens of new tools, timeless traditions. So with each of these, let's discuss together, what is the same? What's our timeless tradition in this new material? And what indeed is new? It's going to be a good way to reflect, I think, and find where it might fit into our curriculum. So Scale Book 3, what's familiar? What's the tradition that's in this book? What hasn't changed? I think we can see pretty clearly that the fact that we have scales in chords, we have the foundations of Western harmony, and that goes unchanged. It's virtually unchanged for many, many years, hundreds of years in many ways, even though we may do certain variations and customs on that, certain derivative creativity, if you will, where we take what is known and what we use ongoing, but then we add on to it, we take some new element but built on the tried and true, if you will. So scales and chords is what's traditional and what's new. The new here is that we're approaching it not just from a up and down scales that just require the finger work and some rote learning, but instead we're getting into real meaningful engagement with patterns of the scale and within the scale. And that's what makes it a talent builder. Sight reading coach, what is traditional here? Yeah, indeed, the sight reading or note reading, that's traditional, that's virtually unchanged. But what's new is that you have a new tool as a teacher that gives you a remote teaching assistant. Because right in the palm of your hand on your phone or your tablet, you can turn on the coach, put the sight reading book on the music rack, and let the phone actually listen to the playing and give feedback to your student. So it's built in polyphonic note recognition. It tracks where the student's making in errors, both note-wise and rhythmically, and can give that feedback back to the student. So in this time right now where you're having to work more remotely, this is an incredible aid in building students' capacity to read. This built-in teacher-student score sharing so that you can know what you can assign and you can know how the student did with the assignments. Many students are very motivated to get to that 90% or 100% score. So use that to the degree that it can be helpful for you at this time. in the series here, Music from China. What's the tradition here? Yeah, I think for many of us in the West, nothing seems too traditional. It seems like this is very new to us, but certainly the music in China has been around for many, many years. If you think of Western music, we go back 400 years to known recorded music, but with China, we go back 4,000 years. So this is built on a lot of tradition. But students in China don't have that opportunity to play their own music, really, during their learning sequence of lessons. They tend to go right to the Western music, which is great, but there's a bit of a being walled off from their own culture. And so we published this in China as a way to provide the pedagogical gradations of very authentic music from China. It's been extremely well received, and the idea is that we can have students in their own culture celebrate, have the self-esteem of playing music that really goes back to the traditions with their roots. So the newness then is in the pedagogical sequence. The tradition is in the nature of that music. We could think too, it's worthwhile taking a look at this. If you think about what's a feature of music from China, what would come to mind? Well, the pentatonic scale, our 1, 2, 3, 5, and 6. We get this sort of a scale that we often use, don't we, in teaching for improvisation. And if we take that same scale that's used in Chinese music, by the way, but we shift it so that the A is the tonic note, same notes, but now we get a kind of a blues scale, if you will. So it's the same pentatonic scale, but shifting the mode of that scale. And so we think of that as being Western, but these same two modes, I believe they were called the Yud mode and the Gong mode in Chinese music, is similar to what we do in the vernacular, in the folk music here in America and elsewhere in the Western world. It's very interesting how those both evolve. And from a practical standpoint, it gives practical tools for us teaching creativity. Because what about that pentatonic scale? What is missing in it? Why does it work so well? Yeah, it removes the half steps, doesn't it? There's no leading tone and there's no step 4 to scrape next to the third of the scale. So by eliminating those two tones, we get something that's very harmonious and easy for our students to work with in composition and improvisation. And then we can veer off of that and more creatively venture into other notes as well. So I find this is a powerful tool set, both for doing something that's different and for your Asian students, giving something that's familiar, that may be heartfelt for themselves and their culture. Notice that we're talking about this as musical friendship around the world. And this is so important right now. I think as musicians, we want to lead on this. There's so many pianists in the Asian cultures that are playing Western music, and a tip of the hat to the styles that come from Asia can be really important right now. And we want to bring in a camaraderie, especially amongst we musicians, with those others that are striving to play the piano and create art, make music. So we have our community culture, if you will, that crosses nationalistic boundaries. And I don't think we could have any time more than now when that's important. And for that reason, we're delighted and honored to be able to share the Music from China series. Here are some of the books. Take a look. We have PreTime Piano Music from China. We have Playtime, Level 1, Showtime, Chord Time, and Fun Time, and BigTime. So useful tools, new tools for your library based on tradition. Scale Book 3. Let's dig in. Shall we? You ready to dig into a little bit? Harmony and motion. You know, when we're dealing with scales, it would be nice if we could just snap our finger and have the student learn the information. All of a sudden, key signatures make sense. They've got the scales and they're relating it to the pieces they play. If we kind of think of what our ideal is, we may be thinking that we'd like to open the student's head and pour the knowledge in. And indeed, that's a metaphor that you've probably thought of yourself. I'm not sure if it's the idea what we wish our teaching could be. In other words, that would be the great educational model if it worked, Or is it the model that we typically default to, thinking that it works? But we know it doesn't work, does it? If we make this analogy, we're pouring that knowledge in and it's overflowing. Well, it brings up the question, is the mind full? Is that why we can't just put knowledge in? It's already too busy with other things? Well, that's not exactly the case either, is it? So what do we know? Well, we know that there's teaching and there's learning. And teaching can't be an enforcing of pushing knowledge into the student's mind. It's different than that, isn't it? And why is it different? Why does this push of teaching not necessarily result in learning? Well, we know it's because the mind and the brain is not a container. There's no place in that brain where we can just pour in the coffee, if you will, or pour in the sharps and flats, pour in the knowledge. It's a formed network that happens. We have to have the student build the neural network for the knowledge to retain and the connections to be made. So there's no container, there's only the formation, the process, you might say, of neural network formation. From time to time, I mentioned my pet theory about electrical learning, chemical learning, and structural learning. And I think more and more it's becoming an actual valid theory based on the neuroscience. The electrical is my way of saying that students can be introduced to a concept. There can be a sensory input, maybe a visual or a sound, and that's going to light up some neurons, isn't that? There's going to be the electrical signals that take place. And let's just say we're in the key of D major and we say relative minor is B minor, right? Because we're down 3 half steps, we're at step 6. Student says, yeah, I got it, okay. So now we say, well, so remind me then, what's the relative minor of D? And the student says B minor. But next week, we say, well, so what's the relative minor of D? And they'll go, the relative what? You know, they're not, it doesn't retain because it was only electrical, only sensory resonance. There wasn't anything that's embedded in the mind of actual learning. See the difference? We taught, and we thought we taught, but there wasn't learning. So what do we need for a deeper set of learning? Well, that would be the chemical learning. And what is the chemistry about? Well, that's the norepinephrine, which highlights the energy for the mind to stay alert. And it's the dopamine that says, this is what I want to attend to. This is a rewarding I want to attend. So we're, in essence, igniting the passion of the student. That's why I always say that emotional engagement is the prerequisite to the learning. So we open the student's mind by following what do they want to play, what's their interest, what are they excited about, and we follow those points of attention because there we have the chemical activity happening that allows the student to learn. And the actual elements of that is with those neurotransmitters that are in place and flooding the brain while we're forming the neural pattern, it also brings these glial cells together, which can now start making structural changes of making certain neurons actually structurally more robust. And that takes us to that deeper part of the learning, and that's the structural. We know that the neuron axons have become myelinated. That's a coating, a little fatty tissue coating on the long axons of the neural network. So whatever we're activating at the time, if we keep activating it, that's our mode of practice, isn't it? If we practice over and over, pretty soon we can knock out these certain motor skill patterns because they're highly myelinated networks in our motor network. And similarly, cognitive skills or understanding of 1 and 5/7 or basic harmony, or for a jazz pianist, the 2-5-1s. What's happening there? Well, those are myelinated connections too, where we've gone from something that is new and novel, where we're just exploring it with a curiosity, to something that is a representational anchoring. We actually understand this whole fabric of the lexicon of musical meaning, if you will. It's literally a shift from the right hemisphere to resonating and building more robustly in the left hemisphere. It's a bit of a simplification, but the model is quite accurate in that our professional skills are representationalized in that left hemisphere. It's where we anchor representations and use that for professional skill. So you can see what starts as this kind of a curious novelty eventually becomes our skill. If we lit up the brain And of a neophyte to music, an amateur musician, we're going to see lots of oxygenated activity in the right hemisphere because it's new for that individual. But when you take the brain of the professional, actually there isn't a whole lot lighting up because it's so well myelinated in the other hemisphere that it's part of the natural process. It doesn't take any real extra oxygen, you might say. It readily activates, but not in that intensity. However, if that professional's learning, tackling a new piece, focusing on something new, then we're going to see these areas light up and bounce between the different hemispheres as new connections are made. So that's a little bit heavy, but I think it's interesting and it's important from the standpoint of us as teachers. And if we were to simplify that, would we come down into the simplicity that music has to do with engagement and pattern recognition? So that engagement is that emotional connection such that learning can occur, and the pattern recognition is where we go into deep learning on building patterns. Let's take a look at a couple slides here. We can see passive learning is out, right? Because that's not going to make the changes needed. We need deeper learning, and that comes from active processes, active engagement, active learning. So that's the essence of the scale book, and I'd like to share with you what I mean by that. I'm going to grab the scale book 3 here, Harmony in Motion. And first unit, we're dealing with scales, patterns, flat key patterns, and sharp keys. So we're going to highlight some of our scales here. And right away, within the first 4 or 5 pages, we got exercises that deal with these patterns. Let's take a look at this one's called triplet scales. So we have our scale. Leads to the leading tone and then 1, leading tone and 1, and we'll keep transposing. And so forth. Now notice, what are we doing here? We're going, there's our leading tone, isn't it? So let's go back to C. Leading tone, dominant, and tonic. So we have this anchoring of leading tone, dominant to tonic. So 7 and 5 with our 5, right? In fact, what do we have at the end? 1, 5, 1. And how are we harmonizing that leading tone in 5? Well, there it is, harmonized with 5 in the bass. So when we transpose, leading tone goes up the half step. Now, the way that this becomes a real talent maker is to ensure the students just not reading it here, but they're also doing the transpositions. So our little boxes there on the bottom take the students through the many keys. And don't handhold them. Make sure that they do the work of listening and finding those scales. It'll be easy because they've already been working with exercises on the prior pages. In fact, we can take a look. And the very opening, black key patterns and sharp keys, we don't start in the key of C. That's too easy. They've already familiar with that. Let's start with all the black keys. And so we drape the hand over the black keys and the thumb falls nicely on the white keys. So, and we can listen with some dynamic change. And then E, similarly, falling, feel the black keys, drape on the black keys, and thumb on the white. And across the page, we have sharp key signatures, so we're identifying the key signature, and then importantly, we're saying in that key, which is the leading tone, where's our tonic, right? The half step, and of course that leading tone is the last sharp, and then where's step 5? Different octaves and back to 1. So we anchor that in these keys. Let's go to the next page. We're on page 6 and 7. Okay, so the leading tone is going to be important. So what if we look at melodic resolution of leading tone to tonic? Melodic resolution. How are we going to harmonize that leading tone? Yeah, it's harmonized with step 5, isn't it? So we have 5. We could also harmonize it with a 5-7, or level 1 5-7, or a little meatier 5-7, although that has that double leading tone. So this is going to sound better, isn't it? Or we could take it down here in root position. So let's run through the exercise. And leading tone. Coming back down with the hand. And notice here that 5 and octave below 5. So let's put it in another key. Take that then through this whole set of sharp keys that we're working. The book takes us through sharp key unit, and then it goes into the flat key unit, because there's going to be different fingerings for various exercises with the flat keys that are going to be more fluent on the keyboard. Because remember, it's harmony and motion. So this motion part is extremely important. So fingerings for different scale areas are going to be helpful, and they're accommodated in the nature of these transpositions. How about page 7? Page 7, we have here circles, our wrist circles on scale degrees 1 and 5. So here's 5, 1, 5, 1, and 5, 1. Here, drop. So we get a combination of the circular motions and the understanding and anchoring of 1 and 5 through the scale. Very, very powerful. And how is it most powerful? Again, with the transpositions. So go through that workout and note, as many of you undoubtedly have noted, that wrist circles are technique secrets from the level 3A lesson book and reinforcing the technique and artistry book, also in the Randall Faber book. And the down arrows are arm weight. We drop with that arm weight and ripple. So we can have a sense of pulsing of that arm weight as we proceed. Very importantly, page 9, 10, and 11, this section is called the major third and the tritone. Do you remember when we talked about the pentatonic scale, Chinese music, we actually pulled out the tritone. We pulled out steps 4 and scale degree 7. And by eliminating those, we eliminated the half step. Let's come back to that in a moment, but have you taught scales as tetrachords, you know, whole, half, and the whole, half? The problem with that, I find, is it doesn't have very good application. Maybe in ancient Greece with some improvisation through shifting of modes within the tetrachord. Maybe that made more sense then, but it doesn't make a lot of sense in today's day and age, because Western music isn't going to lead from that scale degree 3 to scale degree 4. To the contrary, generally, it's the scale degree 4 that pulls down and resolves a half step to scale degree 3. So we get that pulling down of 4 to 3 and the stretching up of leading tone to dominant. So it's this sort of thing. And of course, we can flip it over, and it still does the same thing. Leading tone goes up, scale degree 4 comes down. We can hear that in main. Certainly that's used in orchestrations, in the piano writing, and it's the essence of that little 5-7 that we teach all the time, isn't it? So I would relate it to what they know. What's the same? Oh, do you see, remember how we did this 5-7? Well, look at how that pulls in. Okay, so there's some mastery of this that's needed, so we need some repetition. Let's look at our exercise. We have not only this tritone, but the notes in between in our scale are all whole steps, and that lays out our 3 whole steps. That's tritone. And then the major third is 2 whole steps, isn't it? So that's the anchor, that's the stretching to the C and the E. So we get this resolution, and we have 2 pieces of the scale that are very sensible, much more sensible than the tetrachord construction. So I'm going to put 1 on the major third, and then the tritones harmonize with 5, isn't it? 1, 5, 1, 5. Here's a big 5-7. Another key. And 5-7. Let's not do this just in the easy keys. Sometimes I'll start a student all the way on the sharper keys, or the many sharps, that is, the B, for instance. So take all 5 sharps like we did at the beginning of the book, find our major third, and let's lay out that tritone. Okay, there's our 2 pieces of the scale. 1, 5, and the 5, 7. And suddenly that F sharp 7 chord doesn't seem so foreign or so difficult. It feels comfortable, if you will. The book's going to move through flat key patterns as well, and then on into arpeggios, moving through 2 octave scales, 3 octave scales with triplets, all the conventional 4 octave scales. And here, when we're going to the 16th note 4 octave scales, we're going to focus on pulsing. So we're going to down pulses and up pulses, moving through the scale. 1, 2, 3, thumb, and up. So scale steps 1, 2, 3, and fingering there 1, 2, 3, or descending 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So we want to pulse those of the scale so we can follow long scales with more precision. Lots of good stuff in here. If we jump to Unit 6, we see some arpeggio drills. Excuse me a moment, I lost my paper clip. Here we go. Taking a circular motion, as we did with 1 octave arpeggios, letting that be a warm-up, because whatever we do there in 1 octave, we're going to follow the same circle in 2 octaves, and even multiple octaves. Notice I'm going under the circle and then coming over the top. Under and over the top. So we have this circle. You can do it a number of times if you want. These are great warm-ups for knowing the chord names and getting comfortable with the keys of the chords and the arpeggios, but also the motion that allows the hand to relax, to stay small as we transcribe or as we move through the notes of these wider leaps. Instead of keeping the hand wide, we let the hand open and close quickly, aligning the arm over the finger that plays. And then finally, importantly in this book is the last section on harmony. I'd like to take a few minutes with you on harmony. Turning here to page 64, we have the 1 harmony, right? Building on scale steps. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And a little highlight, notice that 7 chord is anchored with 5, isn't it? So in essence, that 7, yes, it's a diminished chord, diminished triad, but when we add the 5 underneath it, it just becomes our 5-7. And so it's really synonymous for the most part with the 5-7 chord. It's helpful to have the students really be clear on that. So importantly, we need to transpose it, right? And then we can do a little play of circle of fifths. So 1, 4, 7, 3, 6, 2, 5, 1. And of course, we can take that at any tempo and in all keys. So there's that leading tone, so that's going to be a little harder. Now here we get 6, 2, 5, 1. And we're going to highlight those last 2 measures, because what do we have in those last 4 chords? 6, 2, 5, 1. Notice the whole thing's a circle of fifths, but when we work it backwards, we find 5, 1. We can find 2, 5, 1, and we can find 6, 2, 5, 1. It's a great way to work on it. So across the page, we have writing drills where we're going to analyze in the various keys. Importantly, we've got other chord progressions in there and transpositions, and relating those transpositions to pop songs as well as classical and improvisations. I think it's a good point here to move on to some questions and answers. What do we have coming in as questions? Any questions coming in? Here's a question asking about how do I get digital copies of the books. The books, I know you need teacher desk references. It's so important. We're working on some digital availability, and we found a solution, and we'll have that for you soon. We've opened a new section on the website called cloud.pianoadventures.com, and we're just launching that today with the audio store so you can pick up the backing tracks, and we hope to have more resource support for you there. I hope that'll be a help. We also really ramped up the ebook production. The adult and accelerated Piano Adventures books are all available on ebook, and all of the lesson books are coming out. We're just waiting for the Amazon to work through the processing. A question here, what about the scale book? What level is that? It's I call it advancing, but you think of it intermediate to advancing, so it's a great supplement to level 3A, 3B, 4, and 5. Particularly the latter levels there, because it's pretty deep processing. If it feels a little heavy, have the student do scale book 2 or do parts of scale book 2. They don't have to go into F sharp minor and E flat minor and all scale book 2. At least do the periphery simpler keys, and then they can move into all of the keys here with scale book 3. So level 3B, 4, 5 is excellent. And older students, this is a great book for college age kids. It's also a great book for us as teachers if you want to review and strengthen your own harmony skills. Generally, there's elements in there that can benefit all of us. And someone's asking, can you share some music from China songs? Well, let's take a little peek here. I'll just grab one of the books here. This one's the Showtime. And just to highlight what these sound like. The books, as you can see, are 4-color. We've got a lot of cultural information, a lot of interesting elements. This piece is called Crescent Moon. It's a Jianghua folk song. So each of these folk songs are usually coming from different areas of China. It's not a homogeneous country, really. There's a lot of territories, and so the folk traditions can come from many places. Sound rainy day. Many teacher duets, many different sounds, upbeat and slow and so forth. Hope you've enjoyed. Question about a little bit more on the Sightreading Coach app. We bring up this slide here on the app. The nature of the app itself is that it has the ability to listen. It taps the microphone of your device, and it's actually listening to the playing. And then it's taking the sound waves and it's analyzing it compared to how it should be played. So you actually get feedback then for the student. A couple implementation ideas on it is it's easiest when you have the book up there in front, and think of the app can be just next to it or at the side, and that's your teacher assistant. So in other words, the student in their home practice can practice one of the sight reading exercises, practice it over and over, get it into their fingers, and when they're ready, they can click the button there to have it listen and give a feedback. They'll find and correct the wrong notes, help the student know what part to practice. And so coach the student a little bit to take it at slow tempos. You can adjust the tempo to whatever you want. And to be actually working on it like a puzzle. Each one is a puzzle, and the app gives you the feedback for the puzzle. I want to highlight a little bit that the power of the app is also in the power of the material, the books being done. Instead of having sight reading that's just a shock out of the blue where the student doesn't understand the context. Instead, we're building on pieces that have oral models and visual models that are familiar to the student. And with that, the student has much more success. And they can then learn and chunk musical patterns for the note learning. So it's an incredible package, really, when you take the lesson book pieces with a whole set of variations on the piece, and then 88 pages for each level, and then a feedback app to go with it. Really gives you a tool set that can be quite incredible. Sharing a little bit here on the slides, if we look at, here's the accelerated book 1, and just as a sample, it could be any lesson book. But if you want to see how that sight reading works, I'm just going to grab the sight reading book that goes with it. And if we take a song like, if you've heard of, remember this Zoom Golly Golly? And so forth. So what do we have then for the sight reading variation? We get some of the same kind of motivic patterns, but they're going to be little variations in them. So the student is seeing same and different. So still some of the same motifs. Does that give you an idea of what we have? The other kind of, if we want to do it, the more familiar song, we know the Morning of Green. So what might be some of the variations we do with it in the sight reading book? How about? So it's familiar, new phrase, but little variations are taking one measure and moving it in another position. Here's a truncated melody, so to speak, and then imitating the same phrase. And so forth. And sometimes we take it all the way to the day 5, the last variation being a little bigger. And these are wonderful ideas for prompting the students' composition also, because if they can see that these variations can be made from something that's already written, they start to get the idea of the creativity being improvised derivations, derivative creativity, as we talked about early, building on something that's already there. And that's a great stepping stone for the student for achieving their own creative work. I want to close here by sharing just a few thoughts. Still, we might pick up any questions yet if we have a moment. But the question is, how do we stay in touch more? What other offerings do we have of a digital nature? I'm seeing here, tell us more about the timetable of digital tools. Well, we have our player app we're working on, almost ready for the Android player app. We have that already for playing audio files already. We're just working a little bit on the tempo controls and for the ability to play MIDI as well, so you can do all tempos. So that'll be coming around the bend. We're releasing tomorrow, maybe it'll be launched sometime yet today. We'll send you notice, but look at, watch at faberpiano.com. Our technique and artistry site is going up with a couple hundred videos full score and audio tracking on the literature books, and full support for the technique and artistry books of all levels. And so it's a great way to see up close the gestural playing. It has a student link feature, so you can feed that to your student, whichever video you want them to see. So you're still staying in control. It's a great timeliness now to have it, because if you're teaching remotely or you have to give the student a project to work on, get them that technique and artistry book and then give them access to the video so they have some coaching, some imitation of close-ups. And I think you'll be really pleased on how the student will gravitate towards it and repeat and practice and imitate. And that imitation gives that basis for next steps of judgment. And that's really a tool for you. It's a subscription series, but because of the crisis situation that we're in right now, we're waiving the subscription and offering it to you as a teacher for free at this time. So faberpiano.com, check that out. We've also added a discussion forum, and we can use that discussion forum for some more deep conversations about artistry, not only in terms of technique and artistry, but we can also expand it at this time as a very specific forum for how do we have the artistry and the teaching, what's our best practices at this time. So I think we can make that a robust site that can bring in a lot of helpful hints, a lot of helpful tools, and help connect us as a musical community. I want to just mention that our Faber 411 line is open. Some people have been asking here, I see, about how do I get my copies of my books. We understand that Amazon is backlogged. They've got plenty of Piano Adventures books, but they're having to ship medical supplies first. So their book shipping, I think, is slowed down. So if that's any issue for you, we've opened up pianoadventures.com. You can go right to there and order directly, and those books will ship to you promptly. And so you can have the books you need. Teachers are asking here, I see, about teacher desk reference copies. If you're doing some remote live chat teaching or Skype teaching or phone call teaching, it's so helpful to have your own set of books, which you may or may not have in full right now. So call the Faber 411 line, and there's a 40% off special discount on that, and that number is 877-411-FABER. So that's our Faber 411 line, 877-FABER411. And that help is there for you. So that's fully manned, fully staffed site right now to be of service to you. Also, you can email us at faber@pianoadventures.com. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to be able to address more of your questions here as we proceed. I'll be communicating with you from the blog at pianoadventures.com and from the Piano Adventures Facebook page. And indeed, look forward to seeing you live and in person sometime in the near future. In the meantime, let's stay in touch, and let's try to utilize the connections that we have through the blog postings and some question and answer webinar that we'll be sure to offer here again to connect again soon. Thank you so much for your time and attention today and staying with us for this hour. It's a pleasure, as always, to speak with you. Greetings to you from Nancy and me and the Faber Piano Adventures team. Stay safe, and we'll see you soon.